Okay, I'm back. This video is just about the book I'm currently reading in philosophy. It's right here. It's called A 20th Century Analytic Philosophy by one of my favorite writers in philosophy, um, Avrum Stroll. Okay, so I've read through the first chapter, and I'm gonna just basically tell you what I got out of it, and it might be interesting. It, and and then you decide if it's interesting, right, for yourself. Okay, so chapter one, he calls the solar system, um, which is, I had never heard of this term before. I thought it was some philosophical term, but it's not. So I write here, right? So the solar system is his analogy to explain the significance of what like early philosophy still means to contemporary philosophy. Um, and he contrasts this with like ideas in like history and science. So as I say here, Stroll explains how older philosophy informs later philosophy, their relationship with the analogy of the traditional method used in the aging of blending of sherry wine, ensuring consistency and quality across vintages. And this is what's called the solar system. Basically, they store their most their oldest wine in a barrel or a cask, and then they label it, like they identify it, and that's what actually they call the Solera. And then there's the second oldest wine. I forget the name of it. It's not called the Solera, but it's called something else. And then the third oldest wine, and then the fourth oldest wine, and then they end up kind of like I don't want to say diluting, but they kind of mix in uh, all of the older wines with the newer wines, and yeah, that's how they produce sherry, or how that's like the production of sherry involves that process. So in this way, younger wine is gradually blended with older wine over time. And again, which is supposed to capture the relevance of older philosophical ideas to contemporary philosophical thought or ideas. Okay. Now I said this is actually not important to this chapter. I think it's not. He has a point to make about the connection between older philosophy, but to come up with this whole analogy and call it this unnecessary. But okay, it is what it is. I thought I meant explain it since he titled the chapter the solar system. I didn't want to stay silent on that. Now, the main goal of this chapter is to explain the difficulty in defining what is analytical philosophy. Right. The book is called 20th Century Analytical Philosophy, but he's going to be straight up and say like there's really no consensus of what that is. Okay, and so he is going to explain what are some of what generally some people think it is and what others think it is, and like the different like approaches that certain analytical philosophers take, and the other divergent approaches that others take. So the main goal of this chapter is to serve as an introduction to the book, explaining what he will set out to accomplish, which is to give an account or overview of analytic philosophy by discussing the various contributions made by some of its most influential practitioners, such as Frege, Russell, Moore, Wittgenstein, Carnap, Austin, Ryle, and Quine. These are the ones he's going to mainly talk about, whose views he's going to mainly explain. But he also he also mentions other significant contributions that have been made since the 1930s, let's say, until now, by philosophers such as Karl Popper, Chisholm, Davidson, Lewis, Putnam, Ruth Barkin, Marcuse, Paul and Patricia Churchland, often referred to just as the Churchlands, Searle, Zeno Wendler. Zeno Wendler is the only one I had never heard of. Tarski Bausma. I've never known how to pronounce his name. Dummett and Kripke. Right. So these obviously Kripke is probably the biggest name on here, as far as like contemporary or still alive. I think is Kripke still alive? I think I'm not sure if he's still alive actually. So continue. So now So, as I said, while there is no essence to what analytical philosophy is, Stroll notes that the important job of articulating, Stroll notes that everybody recognizes that as an important job, and one important job is articulating the meaning of certain concepts. That's why some people think analytical philosophy is just like uh, about articulating concepts or just defining concepts. Anyway, so concepts such as knowledge, belief, truth, and justification. Okay. But he says there are different ways to accomplish this job, right? There are different ways of articulating these concepts. For example, there's the strict formal approaches of someone like Frege or Tarski. And then there's also the aphoristic, example-oriented technique of the later Wittgenstein and his philosophical investigations, for example. Okay, now, before the creation of symbolic logic, which comes with Frege, many philosophers had this scientism view that science should serve as the role model for philosophical inquiry, or that science really was the only field that produced knowledge, and that everything else was just speculation and something below knowledge, right? Okay, so now, whatever anyone thought about science itself, whether only it produced knowledge, like everybody realized the importance of the creation of symbolic logic by Frege and developed later by like Russell and others. The importance, especially to analytic philosophy, the way of philosophy was done at that time. So many philosophers regarded the combination of logic and science as a new model, right? The combination, not just science alone, but of science as a new model for how philosophy should be done. And the logical positivists were pretty much this is pretty much what they held, right? But also other people were other philosophers were influenced, or other philosophers were informed by this type of thinking, and it's reflected in their theories of meaning and reference. For example, Carnap, Quine, and Putnam. Okay, so people started to think of symbolic logic itself as a role model for philosophical inquiry because it had precision, it had conciseness, and yeah, and you had justification because symbolic logic justifies itself, basically. So this thinking that symbolic logic was the role model for philosophical inquiry with its certain qualities. Peter Simons, David Kaplan, Quine, Davidson, Lewis, Marcuse, and Kripke. All of these people, to some extent, held that view. But not everybody thought that philosophical inquiry should be modeled after symbolic logic. That symbolic logic, like these people thought that symbolic logic, in a sense, not completely, but in a sense, was the ideal language for philosophical thought and knowledge claims, and that things outside its purview was not philosophy. It wasn't for us to even it wasn't philosophy. So, but not everybody agrees with this view. And the later Wittgenstein is notorious for disagreeing with this view, right? He thought that logic was not an ideal language, and that superior to logic were natural languages, and that if you relied on logic, that it's only going to lead to incoherence and sometimes paradox. The logic would lead you there because it wasn't as robust, and it doesn't capture like, let's say, sound reasoning. Like, sound reasoning isn't simply what can be done with logic, right? I want to say encapsulated, but maybe I'm not using that word correctly. So, like, you can do good reasoning, you could do good thinking, you could do good philosophy and figure things out, philosophical problems out, and make headway outside the purview or without relying solely on logic. And that's Wittgenstein's general idea. Okay, so in this book, which Stroll is going to elucidate the various beliefs of the core group of philosophers I mentioned, which are commonly considered to be analytic philosophers, in order to explain their view, how their views were similar, but also importantly, how their views were different. And because they're different, and there is no there's no essence to what is analytic philosophy. So it's this idea of like a family resemblance, which is a Wittgensteinian idea. Anyway, in this way, he hopes to cover the broad beliefs and approaches and philosophical commitments of the major philosophers whose works comprise the analytic tradition in philosophy. And this is generally going to be true for philosophy in general. Like if you ask somebody what is philosophy, it's hard to come up with a definition, right? Is there some necessary condition? And you're like, and there's a lot of similarities in, like, if you take philosophical questions, there's going to be a lot of similarity between those questions, but sometimes there's not. And so then you have this idea that maybe a philosophy, and this is not going to satisfy a lot of people, is just generally the kinds of questions and pursuits, intellectual pursuits, that these people call philosophers follow or do. Right. So yeah, that's not very neat. And but it just might be our best answer. Right. Anyway, so that's it. This is the book. I highly recommend Stroll if you're like generally new to philosophy, because he explains things so clearly. Not necessarily dumbs things down. He's going to give you a thorough treatment of the topic, but his writing is just so good. Like, anyway, so that's why I decided to, like, now that I'm getting back into analytic philosophy, now I'm doing a little bit of history of philosophy, history of analytic philosophy. I have several choices. I have many books, but I went straight to Stroll just because, yeah, he's an easier read. Okay, that's it. I can keep rambling, but I think to the detriment of this video, not that it's going to be very high quality. Where is my stupid mouse? Here it is. All right, so short video. When I'm done with the book, I'll give a book review and maybe not go too in depth because it's too much philosophy. But I'll give a book review and a recommendation, yay or nay. I can't foresee a nay, but I'll have a little bit more to say. All right, that's it. I'm out. See ya.